Hello everyone, this is Professor Robert Solis and welcome to this video lesson. We're going to be talking about arrays within Visual Basic. Well, the first thing that you've noticed is that I have several different text boxes and labels above them, and I would like for you to think about arrays in this fashion. That is, arrays are a collection of items. They could be a collection of numbers, a collection of strings, they could be a collection of buttons, labels, a collection of anything, but they are all the same thing. So for example, if I go ahead and start this program, as long as I am entering the same thing for the array, or eventually we're going to put these text box items into an array. We haven't done that yet. But as long as we do that, then we're consistent with how arrays work. So, for example, if I were to put up a bunch of numbers, let me see here, it's going to be coming up on the screen in just a second. Here we go. All right, so I'll move this over here. And I don't need this guy over here. The error list is not necessary. Let me go back over here and click on the program. There it is. Okay, so let's go ahead and put the number 54, tab, 7, tab, 23, tab, 3, and 99. So in this case, these text boxes all hold whole numbers. Now, the first text box, I want you to think of this as index 0, and this is index 1, index 2, index 3, index 4. So the way that arrays work is the first item is stored in an address 0. The next item is stored in an address 1. Same thing, so forth and so on for the rest of the numbers. So in other words, you start counting from 0. Instead of calling it index 0, I called this guy column 0 because my intention is to show you how to also populate a two-dimensional array in just a moment. All right, so that is populating a bunch of whole numbers within the text box. What if I did letters like R, O, B, E, and R, say for example. I didn't get a chance to put my entire name, Robert, but in this case the text boxes hold a bunch of strings. Again, that is consistent with how arrays work. They hold a bunch of one particular thing. So now let's do this. When I click populate array, what that's going to do is it's going to take each of these letters and put them within an array. So let me close the program and let's go back over here and let me give names to these various items. So we'll call this txt row 0 column 1. And I'll copy and paste this. And we'll do the same thing for the rest of the items. So double click, paste. This will be column, actually this should be column 1. And the other one should be column 0. So let me just temporarily name that column 2 so that I can go back over here and change this to be consistent with my earlier statement, that is that numbers within an array typically start from address 0. So then I'll go over here and call this address 2, and this will be column 3, and finally we have column 4. All right, and let's just simply call this thing populate array. So we'll say btn populate array. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and double click on this guy and we'll go into the code area. All right, so here we are in the code area. And what I want to do is to declare an array. And the way that you do that is simply to type dim and then whatever the name of the array is. So let's say, for example, that I have the 5 items over here. All right, let me go back over here to the design area. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I wanted to store them inside an array called items. So we'll say items is the name of the array, parentheses, and then whatever the last element is for the array. Well, in this case, if we started at 0 and the last one has to be 4 because we have 5 items, so this would be the number 4. And I'll close the parentheses and then I'll say as, and then what is this thing going to hold? let's say it holds a bunch of numbers, and specifically it holds whole numbers. So that means that this thing would hold a bunch of integers. So what I've just done now is I've created an array of 5 items. The first one starting at 0, the last one ending at 4. So what this number right here indicates is the last index. Well, I don't want you to hard code numbers inside of the array to indicate what its size is or what the last array element is. So why don't we go ahead and develop a constant, or create a constant, and we'll say that this thing is called last index. And what last index is an integer, and specifically it's going to hold the number 4. Well, what that allows me to do is to replace this number 4 here within the array and put the word last index. And there it is. All right, so again, nothing has changed in terms of the creation of the array or the size of it. What I'm using is a constant to prevent me from hard coding. So this array can hold 4 items, or 5 items, I should say. All right, well, let me go ahead and populate that. Now, let me do that item by item. So let's say that we'll take item 0. Whoops, let me take caps lock off. And I'll put a parentheses, and that's the first element. That's either called index 0 or element 1. And in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to populate that with whatever is inside of the text box. Well, let me go ahead and convert dot to int 32, so to a 32-bit integer, parens whatever is inside of the text box, row 0, column 0. All right, specifically the text item. All right, what this guy does is it gets this item and puts it into items 0. Well, let me just go ahead and copy and paste this. Control C, and then Control V, enter Control V, enter Control V, and one more time enter Control V. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change these items. So instead of 1, that's going to be 0. And over here, instead of 0, this is going to be 1. And I'll do the same thing over here for the rest of the different array elements, so that I can be referring to each of those different text boxes. This is 3. And this is going to be 3. Finally, this is going to be 4. Let me get rid of that 0. And this is going to be 4. All right. So what this thing does is item by item, from all of these different text boxes, it obtains the value and it puts them, or populates the array as a result of that. Okay, so now what we can do is we can generate some sort of an output statement. Well, let me go back over here to the design tab, and let me go ahead and insert a label. And let's see here, let me adjust this label so that it is auto size false. And we'll make it fixed 3D. Whoops, I'll add a border to it first of all. Border style, fixed 3D. I'll resize it. Something like that. Something like that is pretty good. Let me close the form a little bit. All right. And I think what I'm going to do also is I'm going to get rid of, actually, let me see if I can make this just a little bit. That's okay right there. My computer's going a little slow, I think, because of the recording. That's all right. All right, let me get rid of that label 7. So I'm going to go over here to the Properties panel and scroll down to the text property and hit delete to get rid of that. All right. Let me go ahead and give this thing a name, and we're gonna call this LBL result. You may be asking yourself, what's the big deal about taking the content of each of the different items of a text box and assigning them to an array? Well, what if I wanted you to now display the result of what was obtained by the user and redisplay it onto the screen? Well, you would have to do that for however many items that you were dealing with. Well, since we're dealing with 5, no big deal. But what if you were dealing with hundreds of items? A better approach then would be to populate them within an array, or to post each of the different items into each of the different array elements, and then you can use a loop to either display, to add, to multiply, all kinds of different operations once they are within an array. So an array is a nice collection of items that you can later on manipulate. Whereas over here, this would be very difficult to manipulate item by item within each of these different text boxes. For example, let me go back over here to the code area, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a counter. First of all, let me go back over here and say dim counter as integer. I'll leave it like that. And then over here, I'll say for loops and arrays, they always go hand in hand because they're a nice, neat, concise way of obtaining the items or the values within an array. So we'll say for counter equals 1, 2, and then whatever the last index is. Actually, I shouldn't say 1, I should say 0, because we know that 0 is the initial index. 2, and then I have a constant called last index that indicates the very last item within the array, which is 4, but we use the last index so we don't have to do any hard coding. And it's not necessary to do this, to write step 1. That just simply means that counter is going to go from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 and then finally to 4 and then stop one by one. So it's not necessary to put the step 1 because it's understood that it's going to be incrementing by 1. That is, counter is going to be incrementing by 1. If it's going to be incrementing by a different amount, then you would put step 2, step 3, step 4, however much you want the stepping to be. All right, so in this case, what I'll do is this. I'll say whatever is inside of the label, so lbl result.text. Whatever is currently inside of there, let's go ahead and append to that. So lbl is equal to lbl result.text. And I'm going to concatenate that with, let's say, for example, a space. And then I'll concatenate that, or maybe I should put a comma and then a space. And then I'll concatenate that with whatever the item is within the array. So I can do this. I can say items, parentheses, and then I'll put the counter like that. All right. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So what this does is it will update the label, which is over here in the design view. It'll update that label by first saying, hey, whatever you currently are, I want to append a comma and then whatever the item is within this item's counter. Well, we know that the item is going to be a whole number because that's what we created. We created an array that will hold a bunch of whole numbers. And the nice thing about this nomenclature or this approach is that the counter represents first the first element or the 0 index. So whatever items 0 is, and then counter is going to increment by 1, so it'll refer to the items 1 index or subscript. And then the counter goes to 2, and then 3, and then 4, and so forth and so on. As this thing is looping, we are referring to this item, and then this item, and then this item, so forth and so on, until finally we get to the last index, which we know is 4, and that refers to this guy over here. So in essence, we are reading what all of the different text box items are because we have placed them into an array that is already containing them. Well, let's see what happens. So let me go ahead and click Start. And what I'm going to do is when the form already comes up, I'm going to move it to the upper right-hand corner so that you can see the code in the background and see how it runs. So let me go ahead and close this immediate window. I don't need this. I don't need this autos or local stuff. And let me go ahead and open up the form, which is this guy over here. This guy over here. And I'll move this over here. All right, so now what I'm going to do is populate this thing with numbers. So we'll say 77, 5, 23, 8, and 99, say for example. It doesn't matter that the numbers are not sorted. They are just simply representing a collection of numbers. Well, once I hit populate array, what is this thing going to do? Well, it's going to take each of these different items, it's going to put them within the array elements, and then it's going to redisplay them in this label. So let's click populate array, and there we are. Now we have a problem here in that it's listing a comma first. and then it's listing the items. That's okay. I can make it so that I can ignore the first item and just obtain it, and then obtain the rest of them and separate them by commas. But you get the idea. We are separating all of these different items by receiving them within the text box and then displaying them to the label. All right, so this right here would be referred to as a single dimensional array. But what if you were dealing with 2 dimensions? Well, 2 dimensions kind of looks like a table. I shouldn't say it kind of looks like a table. It does look like a table. So let me just give you a demonstration of that. So for example, what if I did this? Let me take all these different items. I'm going to copy them as in Victor. And let me move these into position. And we'll call this guy row 1. So let me go over here to properties and change this to row 1. All right. So the idea is this. Now a user can populate a total of 10 text boxes, but this time we're going to treat the first 5 as row 0, and we're going to treat the next row as row 1. Now obviously you can continue to create as many text boxes and as many rows as you want. In this case I'm just going to do 2 of them. So this is a 2-dimensional array, which kind of looks like a table. And as you can see here, what we're doing is, move this over here a little bit. There we go. What we're going to do is we're going to take this 2-dimensional array and populate the data into, or populate the items within this text box into a 2-dimensional array. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go back over here to the form. And instead of the word counter, I think what I'll do is I'll double click here and I'll make this a row counter. And then I'm going to establish a column counter. So I can go through every single row and every single column. All right. Over here we've created a single dimensional array, as you can see here. And so I think what I'll do is I'll say this is the last column index. And I'll press enter over here and create another constant called last row index as integer. And we'll set that equal to the last index, which in this case is 1. And I have that described over here. We have the row index 0, the row index 1. So as you can see, 1 is going to be the last index, which is exactly why I've just displayed it over here as the number 1. Okay, so we'll leave our array name as items, as you can see here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all of this. And let's see what happens if I type in last row, which is this guy over here, comma, last column, close parentheses, as, and then once again, integer. Okay. So what this thing does is it creates a 2-dimensional array, indicating the number of rows and the number of columns that this thing has. Well, you notice that I have a bunch of blue squiggly lines over here because I have not properly assigned these text box items into the different array elements. Well, first let me go back over here to the Design tab and let me give these things proper names. Now, as you'll recall, these text boxes have already been named, and I'm going to copy and paste that in just a second. All right, so over here, this item is called txt row 0 column 0. I'm going to take this, copy it, and then I'm going to apply new names for this row of text boxes. So let me double click over here and Control V as in Victor. This is going to be row 1. So I'll just change that 0 to a 1. And this is column 0 for this particular row 1. Again, let me take this, copy it, and then I'm going to change the names for these different text boxes. So let me paste. This is going to be column 1. And this will be column 2. So forth and so on. We have column 3. And then finally we have column 4. All right, so we have all of the different text boxes that have been named, and I better save my work just in case something catastrophic happens here. So let me save all, and I'm going to get rid of the properties panel. All right, so now let's go ahead and populate our two-dimensional array. Well, what we're going to do is go back over here to the design form. Notice that this is column 0, row 0, column 1, row 0, column 2, row 0, so forth and so on. Let's populate the entire row 0, and then we'll populate the entire row 1. Okay, so let me go back over here. So for row 0, column 0, so I say comma, and then I put the number 0 here. What is that going to be equal to? Well, it's going to be equal to whatever this item is within row 0, column 0. So I press enter, and notice the squiggly bar goes away. I'm going to do the same thing for the rest of these. So let me go ahead and put, this is going to be for row 0, column 1. And then I can go ahead and press enter over here. That blue squiggly line goes away. I'll do the same thing for all of these. In fact, let me just start from down here. 0, comma, click up here, 0, comma, and then over here, 0, comma. All right, let me get rid of this extra space. I have now populated my two-dimensional array, which in essence looks like a table, and I've just finished populating row 0. Now let's go ahead and populate row 1. So I'm going to take all these guys over here, copy, enter, enter, paste, and now I have to change these items to 1. So maybe I should start from the bottom. So this is going to be 1. This also is going to be 1. Okay, so now I have populated every single array element, and I have to make sure to change these because this is row 0. This is supposed to be row 1. So let me go back over here and type in row 1 for all the various columns. Okay, there we go. So now that I have all of these items populated, let's once again go through every single row and every single column and try to display them line by line. Maybe instead of commas, I'll just use spaces. Okay, so how are we going to do that? Let me get rid of this for statement here and start over again. So let's go through every single row. So that means for row counter is equal to 0, 2, and then however many rows we have. Well, I know however many rows we have because I have a last row index constant. So we're going to go through those one by one. But for every single row, there are various columns. So let me go back over here to the Design tab to prove that. For row 0, I have 5 columns. For row 1, I have 5 columns. So let me go back over here and say for column counter, COL counter, is equal to 0 to however many items we have. And I already have an indication up here that this thing has 4 columns. Actually, it has 5 columns. It's just that the last index is 4. The first one is 0. Okay. Press enter. All right, so now my for loop is going to obtain first 0, 0. So what that means is as follows. I'm going to take the label and whatever is currently in the label, so LBL result dot text, I'm going to concatenate something to it. Specifically, whatever the value is within that array element. And so let's just do this. I'll just put space and then items, parentheses. Well, the first thing is the row counter. So we'll say row counter, and then comma column counter, close parentheses. What this for statement does is it gets the items at first for every single row 0 item. In other words, it's getting all this data right here. And it's going to populate it within the two-dimensional array for the first row. Well, after I do this, after I've output all this stuff, for the next row, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say whatever LBL result has, concatenate it with a new line. So text, concatenate that with a VB new line. All right. So now this is going to begin at the next line. And then when I go over here to the next row counter, once again, it'll start off with column counter equal to 0. And it'll go through every single item within this two-dimensional array. And it'll display it onto the label. Well, let's see what happens. Let me go ahead and click Start. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to take this guy and move it over here so you can see the code. And let me just go ahead and populate this thing with random numbers. So I'm just typing, hitting tab, so forth and so on. No big deal in terms of the values that I'm entering in, or if they're sorted or not. 6. Let's see here, 9, and let's put in 100 there. Okay, so I have these items. Let me go ahead and now click Populate Array, and you'll notice that every single one of those numbers, 75, 65, 74, 98, that's the first row. And then we have the second row of numbers within the text box. As you can see, those also have been displayed. Why? Because the for loop is taking care of first, for row 0, every single column. And then for row 1, every single column. You can think of this as a slot car that has like an inner track. So notice the behavior of my mouse here. So I'm rotating the outer track. This is just me and my son playing slot cars, right? We're going around a track that looks like an oval. But this for loop over here has an inner loop, or this for loop over here has a nested loop. So this looks like this, graphically speaking. We go through the outer loop, and then we go into our inner loop, and then we go to the outer loop, and then we go to the inner loop, so forth and so on. That's what graphically is happening here. Specifically, we're going through 2 different rows. So here's row 1, column 1, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then for row 1, column 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then that's it, the end of the race. And that's how two-dimensional arrays work. And in fact, that's how arrays work in general. You can create as many dimensions as you want, a 3-dimensional array, 4-dimensional array, so forth and so on. The idea is that arrays contain values, and they are all the same type. If I wanted to make an array that holds a bunch of strings, well, then I'd better make sure that this word says string. Or maybe it's going to say double because it holds a bunch of real numbers. Whatever you want your array to hold, that's what you're going to change this item over here to whatever you want to hold. All right, so this is Professor Robert Solis. I hope that this was a helpful video lesson. Take care. See you next time.